Hello. So today we're going to be looking at Britain's conflicting views of the Middle East in the aftermath of the Great War. And also we're going to be looking at the promises that they made throughout the war to the various groups, in not only England but in the world, and why they ultimately settled on the decisions that they did at the end of the war. My research question is, how did differing views and promises for the Middle East come into conflict with one another after the Great War, and why did the British ultimately make the promise that they made and settle on the decisions that they did make? First, I think we need a little bit of background information on Britain's position leading up to the Great War. By the end of the 19th century, the United Kingdom was the strongest nation on the planet. They had colonies all over the world and influence over every nation on the planet. Despite that, they were still in a rather tenuous position, and they were spread pretty thin. So they were always looking for a way to get a leg up on the competition and find more ways to increase their own prestige and wealth. The most prosperous areas of the empire were in Asia, specifically in India and Malaysia. So any way that could secure the route to those areas would be a very profitable one. There were some key trading ports and trading routes on and through the Middle East that could very much help with this task, specifically in the areas connecting Egypt to India, the lands of Palestine and Mesopotamia, which would allow the United Kingdom to have a land connection from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. This would become even more important when the Royal Navy switched from using coal to oil in the early 1914. To show Britain's interest growing, we can look back at the Crimean War, when the Russians declared war on the Ottomans and were threatening to turn the crumbling empire into a protectorate of the Russian Empire. British and French intervened, and from that point on until the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was under the protection of the United Kingdom, in one sense. They did this in hoping to accomplish what they were already hoping in having that land connection of Palestine and Mesopotamia between Egypt and the Persian Gulf. But by the early 1900s as well, the Ottomans started to cozy up with the Germans, and this was quite threatening to the United Kingdom. So they started talks to the French, and they found that they both had shared interests in the Middle East, specifically with the French wanting Syria, and the British wanting Palestine and Mesopotamia. The French felt that they had a claim to Syria through some historical and religious ties. And this wasn't entirely different from what the British were doing when they were claiming Palestine. There was a religious motive to the British wanting to claim Palestine for themselves. When we look at the Balfour Declaration, I think this is a pretty good point of this. The Great Awakening was this huge revival in spirituality and Christianity within the United Kingdom. It also took place in the United States as well. And many of the people within the United Kingdom believed that for Christ to return, one of the signs of Christ returning to earth was that a home for the Jews had to be reestablished. Many key cabinet members of the British government before and during World War I were adherents to this philosophy. One of the key members of this was David Lloyd George, who very much fell in line with this thinking. And he was one of the people who pushed very hard for establishing a Jewish nation in the Palestinian region. So by issuing the Balfour Declaration, or the desire to establish a homeland for the Jews in early 1917, the British weren't only fulfilling their spiritual needs, but it would also give them a great amount of leverage during the peace conference that seemed almost inevitable at this point, as they would be viewed as the people who would become the protectors of this new Jewish land, and it would fulfill their desires to gain control over the region of Palestine. By issuing this statement, the British also hoped to sort of revitalize the Jewish populations within the Allied countries while sort of demoralizing the Jewish people within the enemy nations, namely Germany, Austria, and the Ottomans. This was just one of the strategies that the British employed to try and gain an upper hand in the Middle East, because things weren't going so well. And as we'll see, they were willing to try anything that would allow them to finally break the stalemate that was taking place in the Middle East. After the rather disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the Dardanelles region of Turkey, the British were in a bad spot in the Middle East. And so, as I said before, they were looking for anything that could help them sort of gain the upper hand. And one of the things that they turned to was Arab nationalists in the Arabian Peninsula. The main man that they worked with was a man by the name of Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, who was the Sharif of the Hejaz and the Emir of Mecca and Medina. Hussein very recently got into the ideas of an Arab state. And shortly after the Ottoman involvement in the war, the British approached him to incite an Arab revolt. A series of letters went back and forth between the British representative, McMahon, and Hussein himself, describing the exact terms and rewards that the Arabs would get for rising against the Ottomans. McMahon kept many of the promises sort of vague, especially around the region of Palestine, knowing that he didn't want to step on the feet of any of the other British representatives working in other parts of the Middle East or in Britain itself. Despite that, the Arabs did rise up under the pretense that they would get some sort of Arab state after the war. Now, the relationship between the Arab revolters and the British did become quite shaky after the Balfour Declaration. The Arabs weren't very upset that it was Jews moving into the Palestinian region. As we'll see in a quote later, many Arabs lived very harmoniously with the Jews already living in Palestine, ones who were culturally, historically, and even linguistically very similar to them. It was just that they weren't a big fan of the European Jews coming in and colonizing the area of Palestine. Along with the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was leaked in late 1917. And this seemed to totally make it appear like the new Arab state that would arise would be little more than a puppet of the British. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was actually an idea that was first proposed by the Russians, as they wanted control of Constantinople and of the Dardanelles in order to secure their trade and navy into the Black Sea. Then the Russians approached the French and the British to sort of solidify that this idea would be something that they approve of. And they proposed that the British and the French also jump in on this deal. As we've known earlier, that the French and the British also had very strategic interests in the Middle East. And even when the Russians fell out of the deal, they were still very much interested in it. The wording within the document didn't rule out the possibility of an Arab state, but it implied it would be more of a protectorate. Its wording states that the Arab state can only trade with the British or the French. The British or the French would have complete control over their ports. It would have complete control over its railroads and where the railroads would be built. So whatever Arab state would arise would, as I said earlier, it would be little more than a puppet or a vassal state of the British themselves. Understandably, this made many people within the Arab world quite unhappy, including Hussein himself. But they hoped they could hash out this problem during the Paris Peace Conference. And during this peace conference, Hussein sent his son, Prince Faisal, along with a large Arab delegation, to try and work out a solution to this problem. Prince Faisal had a speech that was helped to be prepared by Lawrence of Arabia, and it hit on a lot of the main points that he he and his people were trying to make in regards to the Sykes-Picot Agreement specifically. Here he notes that they specifically want control of their railways, their education, and their telegraphs. These are a direct response to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And in this next excerpt, he's talking about how many of the people in Palestine are Arabs themselves, and the Jews living there are basically Arabs themselves in a lot of ways. They lived together harmoniously for a very long time, and it's not the Jews that are bothering them from the Balfour Declaration. It's the idea that they're outsiders and that they don't belong in this part of the world that is really rubbing them the wrong way. Despite his protest, his words went completely unignored, and Prince Faisal and his delegation left in protest after the Paris Peace Conference. In 1920, the British would create multiple League of Nations mandates that they controlled, which were basically other parts of their empire. They essentially took this land for themselves. And it may seem like the British were backstabbing and they betrayed the Arabs, and just took the land for themselves, and they would eventually give this land to the Jewish people, establishing a foreign European Jewish community in the middle of the Arab world. But in reality, it was more of a complete mess of the Great War itself. The British needed to win the war, especially in the Middle East, which was another huge front that had stagnated, and they needed any way to win the war. It's much more likely that the British government sent out all these representatives with the idea that they would act on behest of the British government and find some way to improve the British front in that area of the world. Whether it's on the home front with the Balfour Declaration being declared, or out in the field with Lawrence of Arabia and others in the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, these men were each trying their own way to try and increase the British Empire's interests in the war and in the world. After the war, they had to try and balance all these different promises and decisions that they made. So they didn't plan on being conniving or backstabbing. But they had so many promises and so many decisions that they had to take into account, including their own, in which they ultimately ended up going with. And I think that's the main idea that needs to be taken out of this whole mess that is the Middle East, both during and after the Great War, is that the British are sort of stumbling their way through the war instead of maniacally thinking of how they could betray and cheat their way into getting what they wanted.